Norval Upshaw stood at the window of his general store on the morning of November 3rd, 1886, and looked out at the road that led west toward the Marsh homestead. The road was packed, dirt gone hard with the first serious cold, and it ran straight as a surveyor's line through the brown grass until it disappeared over a low rise. He had been standing at that window for 10 minutes. He was not a man who stood at windows. He had a piece of paper in his coat pocket. He had written it himself 2 weeks ago, the night after Alvin Marsh's funeral, sitting at the small desk behind his counter by lamplight. The paper was a land offer. The figures on it were fair by his own reckoning, which meant they were lower than what the land was worth in a good year, but reasonable given the circumstances. A widow alone, half a quart of firewood short of what she needed, a claim that would revert to nothing if she could not prove it through the winter. Norval had folded the paper into quarters and put it in his pocket that morning, with the intention of riding out to the Marsh place before noon. That had been 3 hours ago. He was still at the window. He watched the road for another moment, then turned back to his counter. The paper stayed in his pocket. He told himself he would go tomorrow when the ground was harder and his horse wouldn't struggle in the mud from last week's rain. He told himself there was no hurry. The widow wasn't going anywhere. Not yet. What he did not tell himself, because Norval Upshaw was not a man given to admitting things he preferred not to know, was that something about the road made him hesitate. Something about the way it ran straight and empty toward a place where a woman was doing something with her dead husband's quilts that no one in the settlement could quite explain. He went back to his ledger. He opened it to a fresh page, and then without planning to, he wrote at the top of that page a single name, H. Marsh. He looked at the name for a moment. Then he wrote beneath it November. Would purchase none. He didn't know why he was keeping track. He was a man who kept track of things. He told himself that was all it was. 2 miles west of Norval Upshaw's window, Hattie Marsh was on her knees on the plank floor of her cabin, measuring 5 inches of air with a strip of leather she had cut from one of Alvin's old bootlaces. She had knotted the leather at the 5-inch mark. She pressed one end against the wall log and stretched the leather out flat. When the knot touched the head of the wooden stake she had just pounded in, she moved to the next stake position and did it again. She had been working since before dawn. The cabin was one room roughly 16 feet by 18 with a single window on the south wall and a door on the east. Alvin had built it in the spring of 1883, the year they filed the claim, and he had built it the way men built things on the Kansas prairie when they were in a hurry and the weather was coming. Fast and functional and not quite tight enough. The chinking between the logs was a mixture of clay and grass that had dried out over 3 summers and now had gaps you could slide 2 fingers through in places. At night, when the wind came down from the north, Hattie could hear it moving through those gaps like breath through a reed, a low, persistent whistle that had kept her awake most of October. Alvin had planned to re-chink in the fall. Alvin had planned a great many things that fall. She found the next position for the stake, pressed the bootlace against the wall, and hammered. The sound rang through the cabin. Outside, the sky was the color of old tin. She was nearly finished with the north wall when the door opened. Queenie Finley did not knock. She had not knocked at this door in the 11 years that Hattie had lived within visiting distance of her, and she saw no reason to begin now. She stepped inside with her skirts gathered in one hand and looked at the quilt that Hattie was in the process of hanging, and said nothing for a long moment. Ada Gartner stood just behind her in the doorway, way younger by nearly 30 years, her hands folded in front of her, the way she always held them when she was somewhere she wasn't sure she wanted to be. Ada had buried her own husband 10 months ago. She had been accompanying Queenie on calls ever since, partly because Queenie had asked her to, and partly because Ada had nowhere else particular to be. Ada looked at the quilt. She looked at the wooden stakes. She looked at Hattie, who had not stopped working. "What on earth are you doing?" Queenie said. She said it the way a person says something they have already decided to disapprove of the question. More of a statement, the answer almost beside the point. "Insulating," Hattie said. She hammered another stake. "Those are your grandmother's quilts." "Yes, they are. They belong on a bed." Hattie set down the hammer and stood. She was 28 years old with dark brown hair, pulled back tight, and eyes that were a particular shade of gray-green that looked different depending on what she was thinking. Right now, they were very still. She looked at Queenie Finley the way you look at weather, assessing. "My grandmother," Hattie said, "would rather keep me alive than be respected in a pine box." Queenie adjusted her eyeglasses. They were small, wire-rimmed glasses that she wore low on her nose, which meant she was always looking slightly over them at things which gave everything she observed the quality of being found wanting. The ladies' aid met last Thursday, Queenie said. We talked about your situation. I wasn't aware I had a situation. You have a homestead that requires a man's management and a woodpile that will not last past Christmas. Queenie's voice was precise and not unkind, which made it worse. We are concerned. The winter is coming in hard this year. Mr. Finley has it from the Osage traders that it will be the worst in a decade. Hattie turned back to the wall and picked up the hammer. There is a widower in Dodge City, Queenie continued, a Mr. Calvin Draper. He is 53 years old, which is older than you might prefer, but he is established and he has a proper house. Mr. Finley could write to him on your behalf. A letter before Christmas, a meeting in the spring. It would solve a great many of your difficulties. Hattie drove a stake into the log with one clean blow. I am not interested in a husband, Mrs. Finley. You are interested in surviving the winter. Yes, that is exactly what I am interested in. She moved to the next position, which is why I am doing this. Queenie looked at the quilts, the stakes, the measured gap between the fabric and the wall. Her expression was one Hattie recognized. It was the expression of a person who has already concluded that something is wrong and is simply waiting for the person doing the wrong thing to come to their senses. You are going to hang your grandmother's quilts on your walls, Queenie said, like curtains in a fabric shop. That is correct. And you believe this will keep you warm. I believe this will keep me alive. A silence settled between them. Ada, still standing in the doorway, had not moved. She was watching Hattie's hands, the way they worked, the precision of it, the bootlace measuring tool, the even spacing. There was something about the deliberateness of it that Ada could not quite look away from. The ladies' aid, Queenie said, and her voice had shifted slightly, taken on a softer edge that was in some ways more pointed than the harder one, has the authority to petition Reverend Finley regarding cases of concern in the congregation. Cases where a member of the community may not be managing their affairs in a manner that is sustainable. She paused. We would not want to involve the Reverend in a private matter, but if circumstances were to reach a certain point before Christmas. Hattie set the hammer down. She turned around and looked at Queenie Finley fully, the way she had not quite done since the woman walked in. Are you telling me, Hattie said, that if I do not find a husband or sell this claim before Christmas, you will petition your husband to intervene in my land? I'm telling you that the community cares about your welfare. That is not what you said. Another silence, longer this time. If there is anything we can do, Queenie said, with the careful dignity of a woman who has retreated without quite admitting it, you have only to ask. She moved toward the door. Ada stepped aside to let her pass. At the threshold, Queenie turned back once more and looked at the quilt, half-hung, swaying gently in the draft from the open door. Alvin was a good man, she said. He deserved better than this. She meant it as a kindness. It landed the way such kindnesses sometimes do. Then she was gone, and Hattie was alone in the cabin with Ada Gartner, who was still standing in the doorway, looking at her with an expression that was harder to read than Queenie's had been. Ada did not follow Queenie immediately. That was the thing Hattie noticed first. The older woman was already at her buggy gathering her reins, and Ada was still standing here, one hand on the doorframe, looking into the cabin. I am sorry about Alvin, Ada said. Her voice was quieter than Queenie's, without the precision, without the management. Just words. He was kind to my husband George when we first came out. Showed him which draws held water in dry August. Hattie looked at her. I didn't know that. Ada nodded. Then she looked at the half-hung quilt, the stakes, the careful 5-inch gap that Hattie had measured out with a dead man's bootlace. What does it do? She asked. The gap. Traps the air, Hattie said. Cold air from the wall hits the trapped air and stops. Can't move, can't take the heat with it. Ada looked at the quilt, looked at the wall behind it, looked at the 5-inch space between them. Then she said, can I help? Hattie studied her for a moment. Then she picked up a handful of stakes from the floor and held them out. Ada stepped inside. That was how it had come to this. Not in one moment, but in a series of small ones that had begun in September, when a man's hand slipped on a wet axe handle, and the cut went deep, and the red that followed went black, and the black that followed took Alvin Marsh in 3 days of fever that no prayer or poultice could break. He had been cutting the winter wood. The irony of that was something Hattie had not allowed herself to examine directly. She set it to one side the way you set something very hot to one side carefully on a surface that can bear the heat. She was left with half the cord he had planned and a claim that meant nothing if she could not prove it through to spring. The land office in Dodge City was clear on the matter. Continuous improvement, continuous habitation. You could not simply lock the door and winter in town and come back in April and call it yours. You had to stay. You had to last. The other settlers in the county had their expectations about what a widow would do. Those expectations had a grammar to them, a sequence. The widow would struggle through one season, possibly two if she was stubborn. Then she would sell, or she would accept help that came with conditions, or she would go back east to family. The Prairie was not a place a woman held on to alone. The Prairie was not interested in what a woman could do alone. Hattie was 28 years old. She had been on this land for 3 years. She had planted and harvested and mended and dug and carried and built alongside Alvin, and she had no intention of becoming a paragraph in someone else's story about what the Prairie does to people who don't belong. What she needed was a solution, fast and cheap and possible. She found it in a general store on a Thursday in late October, and she found it by accident, and she found it because she was out of other ideas, and therefore willing to sit down next to a woman most people in the settlement preferred to walk past. Solveig Eklund was 71 years old and had been in Kansas since 1846, which made her older in the territory than the state itself. She had come from Uppsala with her husband Gustav when Kansas was still Indian territory, and the nearest town of any size was 3 days east by wagon. Gustav had died in the winter of 1847. Solveig had stayed. 40 years alone on the same claim was something the settlement could not quite account for, and so they accounted for it by deciding she was odd. Her English had an accent that seemed to thicken rather than thin with the years. She talked about Sweden to people who had no interest in Sweden. She kept her cabin in ways that looked peculiar from the outside and that no one had thought to ask about from the inside. When Hattie walked into Norval Upshaw's general store that Thursday afternoon, Solveig was sitting on the wooden chair near the iron stove, her hands working a length of gray knitting wool, her boots too large for her feet because her feet had swollen with age, and she wore what fit rather than what looked right. Norval Upshaw was behind his counter moving cans of rendered lard. He acknowledged Hattie with a nod that was neutral, which was his version of polite. Hattie needed flour lamp oil and something for the gaps in the chinking if the clay mix she had could not be made to set before the ground froze. The chair next to Solveig was the only place to sit while she waited for Norval to finish with the man ahead of her in the order of things. She sat down. Solveig looked at her sideways. "You are the Marsh woman," she said. "I am. Your husband died in September." "Yes." Solveig kept knitting. Her needles moved without her looking at them, the way long practice makes things move. "You are staying," the old woman said. It was not a question. "I am staying," Hattie confirmed. "Through the winter." "Through the winter." Solveig made a sound that might have been approval. "Good. Leaving is usually the wrong answer." She paused, the needles still moving. "You have enough wood." Hattie said nothing for a moment, then no. "I thought not." Solveig set her knitting in her lap and turned to look at Hattie directly for the first time. Her eyes were a very pale blue, the color of shallow water over limestone. "I have something to tell you," she said. "Most people do not want to hear it because it sounds too simple. Things that sound too simple make people suspicious. They think there must be a trick." "I am not suspicious of simple things," Hattie said. Solveig reached into the collar of her dress and unwound the wool scarf she wore around her neck. She held it up by one end, let it hang loose, and then blew gently across its length. The wool shifted in the moving air. "When air moves," Solveig said, "it carries heat with it. It takes heat away. This is why wind makes you cold, even when the temperature is not so very low. The air is moving and moving air steals." She gathered the scarf into a loose bundle in her two hands, compressing it, so the fibers were close together. The air pockets between the threads made smaller. She held it out toward Hattie. "Now blow," she said. Hattie blew across the bundled scarf. The air deflected off the surface. It could not move through. "When air cannot move," Solveig said, "it cannot steal. It sits still. It becomes what we called in Swedish dödluft. Dead air, air that does nothing. And because it does nothing, because it cannot move, it also cannot carry your heat away." She lowered the scarf. "You hang a quilt 5 inches from a cold wall. You trap a column of dead air between the quilt and the wall. The cold from the wall hits that trapped air and stops. Your room keeps its heat because the heat has nowhere to go. She put the scarf back around her neck and picked up her knitting. But, she said without looking up, the fabric must not touch the wall, even one corner touching, one place where the fabric contacts the cold wood and the system fails at that point. The cold conducts through the contact. You must maintain the gap at every point. Hattie sat with this for a moment. In her mind, she was already walking the walls of her cabin, already measuring, already seeing which quilts were heavy enough for the north wall, where the Canadian wind came straight and unbroken across 400 miles of flat ground. From behind the counter, Norval Upshaw had gone very quiet. He was no longer moving the cans of lard. He was writing something in his ledger, but his pen had stopped moving. "You have tried this yourself," Hattie said. "It works." "For 40 years," Solveig said, "since the winter Gustav died." She said it flat without self-pity, the way you state a fact. "He did not believe me. He took down what I hung. He said it looked strange. He said the neighbors would talk." The pale blue eyes stayed on the knitting. The neighbors talked at his funeral instead. A silence opened between them. Norval Upshaw, behind his counter, did not move. "I have tried to tell others," Solveig said. "3 people over the years. None of them listened all the way through. Either they thought it was too simple, or they thought it was foreign foolishness, or they simply could not believe that something so small, a gap of empty air, could do what I said it would do." She glanced at Hattie sideways. I'm telling you now because you are going to try it whether I explain it or not. You have that look." "What look?" "The look of a woman who has already decided the question and is just looking for someone to confirm the direction." Hattie almost smiled. It was the first time in 6 weeks that her face had done anything close to that. She bought her flour and lamp oil. At the door, she paused and looked back at the old Swedish woman in the oversized boots knitting in her chair by the stove. "If I do it right," Hattie said, "will it be enough?" Solveig looked up. "It will be enough," she said, "but do it right." She did it in 2 days. She worked from the north wall, south, hanging the heaviest quilts. First the ones with the thickest batting, the ones her grandmother had made in Pennsylvania, before the family moved west, and before quilts were something you talked about rather than simply used. The north wall received 3 of them, hung from stakes. She pounded into the logs at 6-inch intervals, a rope run between the stakes and the quilt draped over the rope, so the weight fell straight and the fabric did not bow inward toward the wall. Ada Gartner came back the second morning without being asked. She arrived as Hattie was finishing the east wall, stomped the mud from her boots at the door, and went directly to the unfinished section without ceremony. "I measured wrong yesterday," Ida said, picking up the bootlace. "The south corner. I think it's touching." Hattie went and looked. Ada was right. One corner of the lighter quilt on the south wall had sagged and was resting against the log behind it. Hattie pulled the stake, repositioned it a half-inch further out, and rehung the quilt. She ran her fingers along the bottom edge to check the gap. They worked in a silence that was comfortable enough. Ada was not a woman who talked to fill space, which Hattie appreciated. When they did speak, it was about the work, whether the batting on one particular quilt was thick enough for the west wall, whether the door needed a second curtain hung inside it to create what Solveig had called a lock of air. She said it like she had said it 100 times. Ada told Hattie, who hadn't heard all of Solveig's explanation because Ada had been listening from the doorway. The dead air, like it was just a fact of the world, and she couldn't understand why everyone didn't already know it. 40 years, Hattie said. She has been doing this for 40 years. Ada didn't answer right away. She was adjusting the stake placement on the west wall, pressing the bootlace flat, checking the knot against the stake head. When she spoke, it was without looking up. "My husband, George," she said, "last winter, he burned everything we owned that would burn. The table, the chair bottoms, the spare door." She pulled the stake, moved it a 1/4 inch, pressed it in again. It still wasn't enough. Hattie held the quilt flat while Ada reset the stake. "I know," she said. Ada nodded and didn't say anything else. By late afternoon of the second day, the cabin walls were covered. Every surface had its quilt or blanket hung 5 inches out from the logs, the cotton and wool and batting, creating a new interior room inside the original one. The window on the south had a quilt that could be drawn back during daylight hours, to let in the thin winter sun, and Hattie had hung a second curtain 3 feet inside the door, creating the airlock Solveig had described, a small vestibule of dead air that would stop whatever cold came in with each opening of the door. The cabin looked strange. She knew it looked strange. It looked like the inside of a patchwork tent, the colors of the quilts bright against the rough darkness of the log walls they concealed. Her grandmother's double wedding ring hung on the north wall next to the blue and white star pattern her mother had given her at her wedding, next to the simple striped wool blanket she and Alvin had bought in Wichita on their way to file the claim. She lit the stove at 4 in the afternoon, loaded it with a modest amount of wood, and sat down to wait. The difference was not gradual. It was sudden in the way that understanding is sometimes sudden, the moment when something you have been looking at resolves into what it actually is. Within an hour, the cabin was warm, not less cold than usual. Warm, the kind of warm that let her take off her shawl and sit in her dress sleeves without noticing the cold at all, which was something she had not done since September. She kept the fire at the same level all evening. Usually she fed the stove every 30 minutes through the night to keep the temperature from dropping to the point where the water bucket at the edge of the room would skin over with ice. That night she loaded the stove once before bed, banked the coals, and lay down. She woke at 3 in the morning out of old habit. The cabin was dark. The fire was down to a low red glow in the grate. She lay still and waited for the cold to find her. It didn't. She reached out from under her blanket and put her hand flat against the face of the quilt hanging nearest her bed. It was warm the way a surface is warm when the air behind it is warmer than the air in front. She stretched her arm further, reached around the edge of the hanging quilt, and pressed her palm against the log wall behind it. Cold. Bone-deep winter cold, the kind of cold that has no intention of going anywhere. 5 inches of dead air between her hand and that cold. 5 inches that was doing everything Solveig Eklund said it would do. She lay back down and looked at the ceiling in the dark. She thought about Alvin, which she did every night, the same thoughts, the same contours of grief, the same particular silence that a person leaves behind them that is different from any other silence. She thought about the axe in the September morning and the way a life can hinge on a single slip of the hand. She thought about the ledger she had started keeping, the small notebook she had bought in July to track planting schedules now repurposed. Every day since she had hung the quilt, she had written down how much wood she burned and what the temperature was when she woke. 3 nights of data. 3 nights of less than half the wood she had been burning before. In the morning, she went outside and stood by the wood pile in the early gray light and counted. She did the arithmetic twice to be sure. If the rate held, she had enough wood to reach March. Not Christmas, not the end of January that she had privately set as her best possible outcome. March. She stood in the frozen mud by the woodpile for a long moment. The sky was low and silver, and the grass bent in a cold wind that smelled like snow still a week away. 2 miles east, Norval Upshaw's store was just opening. A mile south, Queenie Finley was telling someone something about the widow Marsh and the quilts on her walls. Hattie stood there in the cold without her coat because she had come out quickly, and she noticed that she was not as cold as she should have been. Her core was still warm from the cabin she had just left. She thought the quilts held heat all night. I am walking outside with that heat still in me. She almost laughed. She did not quite laugh because there was still too much grief in the space where laughter lived, but her face did something close to it alone in the frozen grass. A quarter-mile away on the road east, Norval Upshaw was riding past on his gray horse, and he was looking at the road ahead, and then he was looking at her. She could see him from here, a large man on a large horse, sitting very still. He stopped. He looked at her, standing by her woodpile in the cold without her coat, and she looked back at him, and neither of them waved. She could not see his expression at this distance. She could see that his right hand moved to his coat pocket, paused there, and then dropped back to the reins. He rode on. She watched him go until he disappeared over the rise. Then she went back inside where the air was still warm from last night's fire, and the quilts hung quiet against their stakes, doing nothing at all, which was exactly what she needed them to do. Norval Upshaw had been keeping 2 sets of books since the morning he watched Hattie Marsh standing by her woodpile without her coat. The first was the one his customers expected inventory credit payments, do the ordinary arithmetic of a general store in a settlement that ran on barter as much as coin. The second set lived inside the first, tucked between the standard columns in a handwriting smaller than his usual hand, almost as if he was hiding it from himself. Names, dates, wood purchased, cords, half cords, quarters. Every family in the settlement who had bought fuel from him since October recorded against the calendar in a way that let him see at a glance who was burning through their supply and how fast. He was not a sentimental man. He told himself the records were useful. Information was useful. A merchant who understood his customers' situations was a merchant who could anticipate demand-manage inventory, make better decisions about what to order from Dodge City before the roads went bad in January. He told himself that was why he was doing it. By the first week of December, the second set of books showed him something he had not expected to see. The Caldwell family 4.5 cords purchased since October 1st. The Reinhold place 3 families wintering together, 6 cords, and asking about availability of a 7th. Reverend Finley's household and the church together already passed 8 cords with 3 months of cold still ahead. Hattie Marsh nothing, not a stick. He stared at that line in his ledger on a Tuesday morning with a cup of coffee going cold beside him and thought about the quilts on her walls and the 5-inch gap and the old Swedish woman in the oversized boots who had explained something to Hattie in his store that he had pretended not to hear. He pulled out the land offer from his coat pocket and set it on the counter beside the ledger. He looked at both documents for a long time. Then he put the land offer back in his pocket and went to serve his first customer of the morning. 3 miles east of the store in the white clapboard house next to the church, Queenie Finley was writing a letter. She wrote letters the way she organized meetings with agenda and purpose, and a clear conclusion established before the first sentence was committed to paper. This one was to a woman she knew in Larned, a woman who was the sister of the widow who was the aunt of the man in Dodge City named Calvin Draper. The chain was long, but Queenie was patient with chains. She believed in the slow accumulation of correct arrangements. She was midway through the 3rd paragraph when her husband came in from the church and stood in the doorway of her sitting room in his coat and boots, which meant he had not intended to stay long. "I stopped at Solveig Eklund's this morning," he said. Queenie did not look up from her letter. "You have called on her before." "I stayed longer than usual." He was quiet for a moment. "We talked about the Marsh woman." Now Queenie looked up. Reverend Ambrose Finley was 58 years old and had been a minister in the Prairie settlements for 22 years. He was a tall man who had learned to make himself smaller in low doorways, and the habit had carried over into the way he held himself, generally his shoulders, slightly forward, head inclined, the posture of a man accustomed to fitting into spaces that were not quite built for him. He had a calm that was genuine rather than performed, which was rarer than it sounded, and Queenie had loved him for 31 years, partly because she could not always tell what he was thinking. Right now, she had a feeling she was about to find out. "Bess Caldwell told me you have organized a petition," he said. "A discussion," Queenie said, "among the Ladies' Aid regarding Mrs. Marsh's situation. The Ladies' Aid meets Thursday." "Yes, I would like to attend." Queenie set down her pen very carefully. "The Ladies' Aid is not customarily open to—" "I'm aware of the custom," he said. "I would like to attend." He left before she could answer. She heard his boots on the porch boards, then the sound of the horse being walked from the small barn. She sat looking at the half-finished letter and thought about Solveig Eklund, who had been in this settlement longer than Queenie had been alive, who had never attended a Ladies' Aid meeting, who had never been invited to one. She picked up her pen and finished the letter, but her handwriting was different. In the last paragraph, slightly harder, the letters pressed deeper into the paper than her usual careful script. The Ladies' Aid met on Thursday afternoon at 2 o'clock in the side room of the church, 12 women arranged on the wooden chairs that Reverend Finley's deacon had set in a rough circle. It was the kind of gathering that had its own weather, warm in some corners and cool in others, the temperature determined not by the stove, but by alliances. Queenie sat at the head of the circle in the way that people sit at the head of things without a formal head being designated. She had a list. She read from it in the same measured voice she used for everything the number of times Hattie Marsh had been absent from Sunday services since September, the state of the woodpile, as reported by Ada Gartner. During her visit in November, the concerns of several unnamed members regarding a woman alone on a claim at the outer edge of the settlement. Ada sat at the far end of the circle. She had arranged herself on the chair slightly sideways, the way a person sits when they are not entirely comfortable with the shape of the room. She had not been asked whether she consented to her observations being reported to the group. She had not been told they would be. She listened to Queenie read from the list and felt something move through her that was not quite anger and not quite shame and was some combination of both that did not have a clean name. "I would like to propose," Queenie said, looking around the circle, "that we formally petition Reverend Finley to conduct a welfare visit to the Marsh homestead and assess whether the situation has reached a point that requires community intervention." A general sound of agreement moved around the circle. Not all of it, but most of it. Those in favor, Queenie said. Hands went up. Ada counted them without moving. 9 out of 12. Ada, Queenie said. Ada looked at her directly. I would like more time to consider. The room's weather shifted. Several women looked at each other. Queenie's expression did not change, but something behind it changed the way the pressure changes before weather arrives. Of course, Queenie said. She moved to the next item on her list. After the meeting, when the other women had put on their coats and gone out into the cold, Queenie touched Ada's arm at the door. You have been spending time at the Marsh place, she said. Her voice was the soft one, the one that sounded like concern and functioned like a key finding a lock. I understand the impulse. You have both lost husbands, but you should consider how association appears particularly to the Gartner family, who have been kind enough to provide you a home this winter. Ada looked at the older woman's hand on her arm. Then she looked at Queenie's face. I understand, Mrs. Finley, she said. She meant it to sound neutral. She was not sure it did. She was still thinking about it when she walked out into the cold and found Reverend Finley standing outside the side door of the church in his coat, not going anywhere, just standing in the cold air, with his breath making slow clouds in front of him. He had heard the meeting. The side room shared a wall with his study, and the wall was not thick. He did not say anything to Ada. He walked to the side door and opened it, and stepped into the room, which still held the warmth of 12 bodies and the smell of good wool coats and the particular atmosphere of a decision that has been made. Queenie was straightening the chairs. He stood in the doorway and she turned and saw him, and they looked at each other with the ease of people who have been reading each other for 3 decades, which meant the conversation that followed was shorter than it might otherwise have been. Has she broken any law? He said. Queenie continued straightening a chair. That is not the relevant question. It is the only relevant question, he said. Has she asked for help from this community and been refused? No. Is she a harm to anyone in this settlement? A pause. No. Then the Ladies' Aid, he said, with the same calm he brought to everything, should concern itself with Ladies' Aid business. He looked at his wife for a moment longer, the look of a man who has more to say and has decided that what he has said is enough. Then he walked back through the door and closed it behind him. Queenie stood very still between 2 chairs in the empty room. In 31 years of marriage, she had agreed with her husband on nearly everything that mattered. She believed that record was on balance correct. She believed she was right about Hattie Marsh. She believed a woman alone on the outer edge of a settlement in a Kansas winter with a dwindling woodpile was a problem that had a proper solution, and that the proper solution was a man, and that organizing toward that solution was an act of Christian care rather than interference. She believed all of this. She went on believing it, but she did not finish the letter to the woman in Larned. The blizzard came on the 14th of December, and it came without much warning, which was the way the serious ones came. The sky went from low and gray to white and screaming in under 2 hours, and by nightfall, the wind was driving snow horizontal, and the temperature had dropped 30 degrees in an afternoon, and the settlement had contracted to the distance you could see from your own window, which was not far. It ran for 3 days. On the first day, Hattie loaded the stove at intervals she had calculated from her notebook. Every 2 hours was enough to hold the room at a temperature where she could work without her coat. She spent the day mending reading writing in her planting ledger, the notes she had been meaning to make since October. She ate twice. She slept when she was tired. The fire did not demand more than she gave it. On the second day, she walked the perimeter of the quilts and pressed each one at its edges, checking for any contact with the wall behind. One place on the east wall near the floor had shifted slightly. She reset the stake, retucked the lower edge of the quilt. The system held. That second night, she lay in the dark and listened to the wind work itself against the outside of the cabin and felt for the first time since September something that was not grief and not fear. She could not name it immediately. It took her a while to recognize it as a feeling she associated with Alvin, with the early years when the claim was new and the work was hard, and the two of them went to bed tired every night with the specific satisfaction of people who had done what they set out to do. She had forgotten what that felt like in her own body. It surprised her to find it still there. On the third day, the wind dropped, and she went outside to dig the door clear and stood in the sudden silence of a world after a blizzard, the kind of silence that has weight to it, and looked out at the white flats running south to the horizon. The sky was blue. Shadows of the grass stalks made blue lines across the drifted snow. It was the most beautiful thing she had seen in months, and it was also extremely cold, and she went back inside after 5 minutes. Norval Upshaw opened his store on the morning of the 17th with a shovel and a lot of effort and found people waiting in the cold before he had the door fully clear. They came for wood first and earthom everything else second. He worked the counter for 6 hours without stopping, and when the last customer had gone, he sat down on the stool behind the register and opened his ledger. He had sold 11 cords of wood in one day. It was more than he had sold in any single week of any previous winter, which told him something about how badly the blizzard had caught people and something about how thin their margins had been before the blizzard arrived. He went through the list of names, he tallied what they had purchased before the blizzard and what they had just purchased after it. He made calculations in the second set of columns, the small handwriting that was almost hidden. At the bottom of the page, he wrote H. Marsh. Post-blizzard purchase, none. He looked at that line for a long time. Then he closed the store 2 hours early, which he had not done on a business day in 11 years, and rode west on the road that had been drifted over that morning and was now tracked by the passage of enough wagons and horses that the way was clear. Hattie answered the door in her wool work dress without the shawl, which was the first thing he noticed. It was 20 degrees outside, and she had come to the door without a shawl. Norval Upshaw was not a man who showed surprise easily. He had built a career on a face that gave little away. But he stood on her porch for a moment longer than necessary before he spoke. "You didn't buy wood," he said. "I didn't need to." He looked past her into the cabin. Warm air moved through the open door, the kind of warmth that you feel is a physical thing, a pressure against the cold. He could see the quilts on the walls. He had heard about them from everyone who came into his store in November, and he had formed a picture of them in his mind, and the picture was of something makeshift and desperate, a widow's improvisation. That was not what he saw. What he saw was a system, carefully hung, evenly spaced, the fabric falling straight and not touching the surfaces behind it. The south window's quilt drawn back to let in the afternoon light. A second curtain inside the door that he had to step past to enter, creating the small, enclosed space that he understood by feel as soon as he was inside it. The cabin was warm the way a well-built house is warm. Not the aggressive warmth of a big fire pushing heat into a cold room, but the settled warmth of a room that has simply kept what it generated. Hattie took his notebook without being asked when he held it out and opened her own from the shelf beside the door, and they stood at her table while she showed him her records. Every day since the 7th of November. Wood loaded. Ambient temperature at waking. Wood loaded again. Temperature at midday. It was the record keeping of someone who had been testing a hypothesis, not someone who had been hoping. He looked at her numbers for a long time. He had the figures in his own ledger for comparison, though he had not brought that book. He did not need to. He had memorized it. His largest regular customers had burned through a third of their total winter supply in the 3 days of the blizzard alone. Hattie's notebook showed that her rate had not changed during the blizzard. She had burned the same modest amount on day 2 of the storm as she had burned on an ordinary November afternoon. Norval Upshaw set her notebook down on the table. He looked at the quilts on the walls. He looked at the woman who had hung them. He was 45 years old and had been in commerce since he was 16, and in that time he had watched a great many people make a great many decisions, and he had developed opinions about which kinds of decisions indicated what kinds of people. He had put Hattie Marsh in a category in September when he wrote the land offer and put it in his pocket. He understood now that the category had been wrong. He reached into his coat. He took out the folded land offer. He looked at it once the careful figures he had written by lamplight in September, and then he tore it in half along the fold and put both halves back in his pocket. He did not explain the gesture. He did not need to. Hattie had watched him do it without expression, and when he looked at her, she was looking at the torn paper disappearing into his coat, the way you look at something you expected and are relieved to see confirmed. "Who taught you this?" he said. "Solveig Eklund." Something moved through his face. He had sold the old Swedish woman flour and lamp oil and wool for 40 years. He had never asked her anything beyond the transaction. "I owe her a conversation," he said. "She would probably appreciate it," Hattie said. "She has been explaining this to people since 1847. Norval picked up his hat from the table where he had set it. He was at the door when he paused. "I want to carry this," he said. "What you've done here, to the other families. I want to tell them." "It is not mine to carry," Hattie said. "It is Solveig's." He thought about that for a moment. Both, he said. He stepped through the inner curtain and out through the door into the cold. She heard his horse move off east toward town, and then she heard nothing but the wind and the silence of the settlement resettling after the blizzard, and she went back to her notebook. Ada came 2 days after Norval arriving on foot, because the road to the Gartner property was not yet open for a horse. She had not told Queenie she was coming. She had not told the Gartner family where she was going. She had left in the early morning while the house was still quiet, wearing every layer she owned, and walked a mile and a half through snow that was knee-deep in the drifts and packed down to ice in the tracked areas. She knocked this time. She had always knocked, but this time the knock was different, more deliberate, the knock of someone who has decided something on the way over. When Hattie opened the door, Ada stood on the porch with snow to her knees and her breath coming hard from the walk, and her face carrying something that she had clearly been working up to for some distance. "I told Mrs. Finley I hadn't been here," Ada said. "In November, when she asked." A breath. "She asked if you seemed stable, and I said I had no information." That was a lie. Hattie stood in the doorway and looked at her. "I didn't say anything against you," Ada said, "but I didn't say anything for you either. And I knew what she was doing with the Ladies' Aid, and I didn't say anything about that either." She met Hattie's eyes. "I am telling you now because I think you should know what I did and what I didn't do, and because I think it matters that you know the difference." Hattie stepped back from the door. "Come inside," she said. "You're going to freeze on my porch." Ada came in, stepped through the inner curtain, and stood in the warmth of the cabin. She began to peel off her outer layers, and the warmth reached her all at once, and she stood very still for a moment, in the way a person stands when they have been cold for a long time, and warmth is suddenly and fully available. She had been cold for a long time. Since George died, she had been cold in a way that was not only about temperature, the particular cold of a house where there is not enough of anything, and where the person who was supposed to be there is not. She pulled off her gloves and held her bare hands out toward the stove that was barely coughing. "How is it this warm?" she said. "Your fire is almost out." "The quilts hold what the fire makes," Hattie said. "You don't need much fire if none of the heat escapes." Ada turned her hands over, looking at them as if confirming they were the same hands that had been clenched in gloves for the last 2 hours. "Will you teach me?" she asked. "Not for here, for wherever I am next winter. I won't be at the Gartner place." She looked up. "They've told me I need to find other arrangements by spring." Hattie looked at her for a moment. "Yes," she said, "I'll teach you." They spent the afternoon working through the logic of it in practical terms, not theory, but application. Ada was a quick learner, the kind who translates understanding into motion immediately, who does not need to be told twice. By late afternoon, she had internalized the method well enough to identify a problem in the west wall setup she had helped install in November. One stake had shifted in the cold and the quilt had rotated slightly, bringing the lower left corner within an inch of the log. "Here," Ada set her hand already on the stake. "This one." Hattie looked. "Good catch," she said. Ada reset it herself. The afternoon had gone darker by the time they were done, and Ada put her layers back on for the walk home. At the door, she paused. "Can I ask you something?" "Ask." "Do you ever regret it staying?" Hattie was quiet long enough that Ada thought she wasn't going to answer. Then, every morning in October, I woke up and asked myself if I was going to stay or go. And every morning, I got up and started the fire. She picked up her notebook from the table, her finger holding the page. "The regret is there, but the other thing is stronger." Ada looked at her for a moment, then nodded once and stepped through the curtain and out into the cold. Hattie visited Solveig Eklund for the first time since November, on a clear afternoon in mid-January, riding the 4 miles on Alvin's horse, which she had continued to work, because the horse needed it and because she needed it too, the daily purpose of it, the simple animal requirement of something depending on you. She found the old woman awake in her bed, which was not alarming in itself because Solveig often spent the cold days in bed to conserve heat. What was different was the stillness. Solveig moved when she was awake, always something working in her hands, the knitting or the mending, or the slow deliberate writing she did in the notebook she kept in Swedish that Hattie could not read. Today her hands were at rest on the coverlet. "You look well," Solveig said, which was what she said to everyone, regardless of how they looked, as a form of greeting rather than assessment. "You don't," Hattie said, because she was not going to lie to this woman. Solveig smiled. "Honest. Good." She shifted against her pillows. "How is the north wall?" "Holding. No movement in the stakes." Ada caught a shift in the west wall 2 weeks ago. We reset it. Ada Gartner. Solveig tested the name. The one who came with Queenie Finley. Not anymore, Hattie said. Solveig looked at her with those pale eyes. People surprise you, she said. That is the thing about people. They surprise you in both directions. The cabin around them was warm, warmer than Hattie's even, because Solveig's system was 40 years more refined. The layers of fabric were not quilts, but woven wool hung in a way that Hattie had not seen before, with small sewn casings along the bottom edges that held thin wooden rods and kept the fabric from ever moving inward, regardless of temperature change. She had been improving this for 4 decades. She had been doing it alone. I have something for you, Solveig said. She pointed to the small chest beside the bed. Hattie opened it. Inside, folded precisely, was a piece of paper that had been folded and unfolded many times, the creases soft with age. She unfolded it. It was written in English, in a handwriting that was careful and clear, in the deliberate way of someone writing in their second language, making sure each letter was unambiguous. The paper was a set of instructions, not the principles Solveig had explained in Norval's store with the scarf. These were specifics: stake spacing at different wall log widths, fabric weight recommendations for north versus south, exposure the exact depth of an airlock vestibule for a single door in a structure of different square footages. A document built from 40 years of trial and failure and refinement. I wrote this for Gustav, Solveig said, in the first November. He did not read it. Hattie looked at the paper. The ink was brown with age. At the top, in larger letters than the rest, for the winter. Please read this. He took the fabric down because it looked strange, Solveig said. That is what he said. It looked strange and the neighbors would see. She looked at the ceiling. I have thought about that moment for 40 years. What I could have said differently. What I could have done so that he would have listened. A pause. I do not know the answer still. Some people will not hear a thing until they are cold enough to need it. And sometimes cold enough is too late. Hattie folded the paper with the same care it had been kept with. I would like to use this, she said, to teach others. That is why I am giving it to you, Solveig said. I am not giving it to you to keep. Hattie put the paper in her coat pocket. She sat with Solveig for another hour, and they talked about the settlement and the winter and the way the prairie looked in January, when the snow was old and the light was flat and the horizon seemed further away than at any other time of year. They talked about Gustav. They talked briefly and without drama about Alvin. When Hattie stood to leave, Solveig said, without looking at her, Reverend Finley came last week. Hattie paused, putting on her coat. He sat where you are sitting. We talked for a long time. Solveig was quiet for a moment. He apologized for the community, for 40 years. Her hands moved slightly on the coverlet. I told him an apology was not what was needed. What is needed is listening before a person has been silent for 40 years. Hattie finished buttoning her coat. She thought about Queenie Finley's letter, still unfinished on the writing desk. She thought about the ladies' aid meeting she had not been invited to. She thought about Ada in the cold, walking 1.5 miles to say what she had done and what she hadn't. What did he say? Hattie asked. He said he understood. Solveig looked at Hattie with those pale eyes. I think he meant it. Outside, riding home in the last hour of winter light, Hattie passed Reverend Finley on the road east. He was riding toward town, his collar up against the cold. He slowed as she approached. I called on Mrs. Eklund last week, he said. She mentioned you had been to visit. She told me you came as well, Hattie said. I was glad to hear it. He looked at the road ahead for a moment. She is remarkable, he said. I did not know that. I should have known that a long time ago. Yes, Hattie said, you should have. He accepted that without defense. That was the thing about him. He could accept a true thing without needing to argue about it first. She found she respected that even now. I would like to speak with you, he said, when the time is right, about the church, about what you have learned. He paused. Formally. She looked at him. After February, she said, ask me after February. He nodded and rode on. She watched him go and then turned her horse west and rode the last 2 miles home in the cold, with the paper in her coat pocket and the warmth of Solveig's cabin still in her memory like a thing she was carrying carefully. She had just passed the rise above her property line when she saw the light in her window from across the flat, her own lamp burning low the way she left it when she went out so she could find the door in the dark. The light was warm and orange and small against the immense gray of the January evening, and it looked exactly like what it was, a fire that had been banked 3 hours ago and was still burning because the room around it had been built with care and patience and 40 years of someone else's knowledge to hold what it was given and let nothing out. February in Kansas was not the coldest month in the way that January was cold, with its long gray weeks, in the sense of winter being permanent and total. February was the month that broke things. It came in with a particular malice, the kind that follows a false thaw, when the temperature rose for 3 days and people made the mistake of thinking the worst had passed, and then it dropped again harder than before, and the wood piles that had already been drawn down too far went to nothing in a week. Queenie Finley had not spoken to Hattie Marsh since the morning in November, when she had walked out of the cabin with her back straight and her disapproval visible in every step. She had not said Hattie's name at the Ladies' Aid meeting in December after Reverend Finley had closed the side room door on the petition and the subject had died without ceremony. She had not sent word when the blizzard passed. She had not acknowledged in any public forum or private conversation that the winter was now 2/3 gone, and the widow on the western edge of the settlement was still there, still alone and apparently still warm. She had, however, been paying attention. Queenie was always paying attention. It was one of the things she was best at. She knew from Norval Upshaw, who mentioned it without drama while she was buying lamp oil, that the Marsh woman's wood consumption for the entire winter to date was approximately 4.5 cords. She knew this because Norval had said it in the same flat tone he used for commodity prices, a tone that communicated information without editorial, which meant he was letting the information speak for itself and trusting her to hear it. She heard it. She had burned through 7 cords herself. Her husband's church had burned through 11. The building was not large. It was not well built. The coal came through the walls, and the congregation sat in their coats, and Reverend Finley had taken to preaching faster than usual in the deep winter months, which was not an improvement to his sermons. On a Wednesday morning in late February, Queenie Finley put on her heaviest coat and her warmest boots and told her husband she was going to call on Mrs. Marsh. He looked at her over his breakfast without expression. She left before he could decide whether to say anything. She drove herself. She did not bring Ada, which was also a decision, the kind of decision that doesn't announce itself but means something. The road west was packed and ridged from wagon traffic, and the horse knew the pace. It took her 40 minutes. Hattie was outside and she arrived scattering feed for 3 chickens that had survived the winter by virtue of being housed inside the cabin's small lean-to extension, which Hattie had also lined with burlap, hung off the walls at the same interval she used inside. Queenie sat in the wagon and looked at this for a moment. The chicken shed was insulated. Of course it was. Hattie looked up, saw the wagon, and did not change her expression. She finished scattering the feed. She was wearing a wool dress and a light shawl. It was 24 degrees. "Mrs. Finley," she said. "Mrs. Marsh," Queenie said. They looked at each other across the frozen yard with the chickens moving between them, pecking at the scattered grain. "Will you come in?" Hattie said. It was not quite a question. Queenie climbed down from the wagon. The heat reached her before she was fully through the door. Not the dry, aggressive heat of a big fire, but something more total. A warmth that seemed to come from the walls themselves from all directions at once, which of course was exactly what was happening, and which Queenie had known intellectually was what the quilts were designed to do. Knowing it and standing inside it were different things. She passed through the inner curtain. The main room of the cabin was perhaps 2 degrees warmer than the vestibule, which was already warm enough that she wanted to unbutton her coat. The stove held a small fire, the kind you might build to heat a pot of coffee, not the roaring fire she maintained in her own house all day, and still went to bed cold. She unbuttoned her coat. Hattie was already at the stove moving the coffee pot. She did not say anything about the coat. She did not say anything about the room. She set 2 cups on the table and poured and sat down and waited. Queenie sat across from her. She put her hands around the cup. She looked at the quilts on the walls, the sewn and pinned and carefully maintained fabric that she had called foolishness in November, that she had described to every woman in the settlement as a symptom of a widow losing her hold on propriety and good sense. The double wedding ring on the north wall, the blue and white star to the east, the striped wool on the west. She had heard these described so many times in her own retelling of them that they had become in her mind evidence of something. Sitting in the room they made, she was not certain what they were evidence of anymore. 4.5 cords, she said. "A bit less," Hattie said. "I have been keeping count. We have burned 7, she paused. Ambrose has burned 11 in the church. I know, Hattie said. Norval told me. Queenie looked at the cup in her hands. How, she said. And then because she was not a woman who left sentences unfinished, when a complete sentence was what the situation required, how was this room this warm with that fire? Hattie was quiet for a moment. She looked at Queenie Finley, the woman who had stood in this cabin in November, and told her she needed a husband who had organized a meeting about her welfare without her knowledge, who had spent 4 months explaining to the settlement why Hattie Marsh was a problem that needed solving. She looked at her with the same still gray-green eyes that assessed weather, and what she read in Queenie's face right now was not malice and not condescension. It was something more uncomfortable than either. It was the face of a person who had been wrong about something important and had come in the only way she knew how to come to sit in the fact of it. The quilts trap a column of still air between the fabric and the wall, Hattie said. The cold from the logs hits that air and stops. The heat from the stud has nowhere to escape to. The room holds what the fire makes. She said it in the same tone she might use to explain the planting calendar. Plain, without satisfaction. Solveig Eklund has been doing this for 40 years. She learned it from her people in Sweden before she came over. She tried to tell Gustav, and he didn't listen, and he died in the winter of 47. A pause. She tried to tell 3 other people after that. None of them listened either. Queenie sat with this. I was the 4th person she told, Hattie said. I listened. Another silence. The fire made its small sounds. Outside, the chickens had gone quiet. Then Hattie set her cup down and leaned forward slightly, and her voice when it came was not loud, but it had a quality of finally the way a door sounds when it closes on something that has been open too long. You told this settlement I would be dead by Christmas, she said. You told them I needed a husband to survive. You organized a meeting about whether I was capable of managing my own affairs. You came into this cabin in November and told me that my grandmother's quilts were disrespectful to the dead. She looked at Queenie directly. All of that was wrong, all of it. And I want you to know that I know it, and I want you to know that I know you know it too. Queenie did not flinch. She was not a woman who flinched. She sat with those words the way she sat with everything, with the considerable posture of a person who has been holding herself upright through difficult things for 52 years. Yes, she said. The word came out differently than her usual words. All de your buenos, smaller, more accurately sized to what it carried. That was all she said, but it was the word Hattie had needed, and they both knew it. The coffee went cool in their cups. Neither of them moved to reheat it. Then Queenie said, Ambrose has been burning through the church's wood at a rate that will leave the congregation cold in March. She looked at the quilts. The building is larger than a cabin. I don't know if what you've done here can scale to a structure that size, but I would like to know if it can. She paused. He would like to know. He asked me to ask you. I told him I would come myself. Hattie looked at her for a long moment. The firelight caught the angles of her face and made her look older than 28 and younger at the same time, the way strong feeling can do that to a person. Tell Reverend Finley I will come Thursday, she said. Ada met her at the church door on Thursday morning, which meant Ada had known Hattie was coming, which meant the information had traveled from Queenie to Ambrose to Ada by some domestic route that Hattie did not need to trace. Ada had a length of measuring rope and a notebook, and she had clearly been thinking about the problem of a large public building in the way she now thought about all spatial problems, with attention to airflow and surface area, and the specific vulnerabilities of north-facing walls. Reverend Finley met them in the nave. He was a tall man who did not quite fit his own building, always slightly folded at the doorways, and he shook Hattie's hand the way men shake hands when they are not sure what else to do with the situation they are in. Hattie shook it back. Solveig mentioned you had visited her, he said. She asked me to be sure you were putting her name first in any account of the method. That was my intention as well, Hattie said. He nodded. I have been the minister of this community for 12 years, he said. I did not know her name well enough to use it easily until January. He said it plainly, the way the honest ones can say things about themselves without making the statement into a performance of humility. That is not something I can repair, but I can do differently from here. Hattie looked at him for a moment. She told me you apologized to her. I tried to. She told me what she said back. He nodded slowly. That listening is more useful than apology. Yes. He looked at the walls of his church, the rough board siding with its gaps and its inadequate insulation, the high windows that let in light and cold in equal measure. "So, I am listening?" Ada was already walking the north wall with her rope measuring, making notes. Hattie watched her for a moment before turning her attention to the building. The church was a different problem than the cabin. The walls were taller. The congregation opened and closed the main doors continuously on Sunday mornings, which would defeat a simple airlock unless you built the lock large enough to accommodate multiple people. The windows were numerous and single-paned and represented as much heat loss as the walls. The ceiling was high, which meant the warm air rose and collected where no one was sitting. She walked the perimeter. She asked Ada to measure the gap between the wall studs because the internal structure of a frame building was different from log construction, and the solutions would be different too. She asked Reverend Finley how many people attended on a Sunday morning and what time they arrived and how long the service ran. He answered all of it. He had a good memory for his congregation and gave her numbers she could work with. "The ceiling is your biggest problem," Hattie said, standing in the center of the nave and looking up. "The heat goes there and stays there and never comes down to where people are sitting. You need something to interrupt that. Fabric hung horizontally at 8 feet will create a lower ceiling that traps the warm air at the level where it is useful." She looked at it on. "Do you have fabric that wide, canvas, heavy wool, anything that will hold its shape?" "I can get it," Norval Upshaw said from the back of the church. She had not heard him come in. She turned and he was standing at the rear door with his coat on and his hat in his hand, which meant he had not planned to stay, had come to deliver something, and found himself walking to the front of the nave instead. "I have canvas in the storeroom," he said, "wagon canvas. I can have it here by Saturday." Hattie looked at him. "That will work," she said. He nodded. He put his hat back on. He did not leave. Ada came up beside Hattie with her notebook. "If we do the horizontal ceiling canvas in the wall hangings on the north and east, we can leave the south and west lighter so the morning light still comes through. The congregation won't even notice the difference in the room by the second Sunday." Reverend Finley was looking at Ada Gardner in the way adults look at younger people who have just done something that reframes them. He had known Ada for 2 years as an adjunct of Queenie Finley's social world, a quiet widow without much apparent direction. He was looking at her now as something else entirely. "Ada," he said, "I did not know you had thought about this so carefully." Ada looked at him with the steady gaze of a woman who has gotten used to not being seen. "I have been thinking about it since November," she said. "I had good instruction." She glanced at Hattie. Hattie was already writing in her own notebook the numbers. Ada had called out the calculations for canvas width and stake placement in a framed wall rather than a log wall. She was not watching herself be credited. That was one of the things about her Ada had come to understand she did not need to watch. They worked on the church for 2 days. Norval brought the canvas on Saturday as promised. Ada organized the cutting. Hattie directed the hanging, which required a ladder, and the Reverend's deacon and a young farmer named Kermit Hallmark, who had come because Norval mentioned at the store that something interesting was happening at the church, and Kermit Hallmark was a man who went toward interesting things. By Sunday morning, the church had a lower ceiling of canvas hung at 8 feet the north wall, covered in heavy wool that Queenie Finley had donated without announcement, and a double curtain entry that Kermit Hallmark had constructed from 2 lengths of canvas on a sliding rod that allowed people to enter and exit without exposing the main space to the outside air. The congregation came in that Sunday and sat down in their coats, and then one by one took their coats off. Reverend Finley preached at his normal pace for the first time since November. After the service, standing in the cleared yard in the cold, Hattie heard a woman she did not know well say to the woman beside her that the church had always been drafty, and wasn't it strange that it had simply fixed itself? The woman beside her said she had heard it had something to do with Hattie Marsh and the Swedish woman who lived past the creek. The first woman said she had always liked Solveig Eklund. She said it in the tone of a person revising a history they had not lived that way, but would prefer to remember differently. Hattie did not correct her. She walked home. She was at her table that evening, writing in her planting ledger the first spring notes when she heard hoofbeats and then a knock. She opened the door and found a man she had not met standing in the cold with his hat in his hand and a piece of paper that she recognized as one of Norval Upshaw's printed instruction sheets. He introduced himself as Newton Renfrow. He farmed 7 miles southeast, he said, on a quarter section that had a bad north wall situation he had been trying to solve since he built the place 3 years ago. He had read the instruction sheet twice, and he had a specific question about stake placement in a wall where the interior studs were not evenly spaced. It was the most specific question anyone had asked her about the practical application of the method, and she opened the door wider and he came in, and they sat at the table, and she showed him in her notebook how the spacing worked with irregular stud placement, and he asked 3 more questions after that, each one more precise than the last. He was 34 years old, she estimated, with the hands of a man who built and repaired things constantly, and the habit of listening that belongs to people who have learned things mostly by being wrong first. He had brown hair going gray at the temples and a serious face that moved when he was thinking, small adjustments of expression that tracked his reasoning. They talked about the church ceiling canvas and why it worked. They talked about the chicken shed, which he found particularly interesting because he had lost 24 birds to cold the previous winter. They talked about the practical limits of the method in buildings larger than a single room. The lamp burned low without either of them noticing. When Newton Renfro finally stood to leave, he looked around the cabin with the unhurried attention of someone doing a final assessment of a thing he has been examining throughout. "This is the most efficiently heated structure I have been inside," he said, "including buildings twice this size with twice the stove." "Thank you," Hattie said. "I'll want to apply this to my place before next winter," he said. "There are aspects of the setup I would need to think through for a larger footprint." He picked up his hat. "Would it be possible to come back and ask more questions when I have worked through the initial plan?" She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "I'll come back in a week then," he said, "if that suits." "It suits," she said. He left. She listened to the horse move off into the dark. She sat back down at her table and looked at the planting notes she had been writing before he came, the first spring entries in a ledger that had started as something else and become the record of a winter she had survived on the strength of things she had been willing to learn. He came back in a week. He came back the week after that. By April, the visits had acquired a character that was different from consultation, though they continued to contain real questions and real answers. He brought her information about the spring road conditions south of the creek. She told him about a seed source that Norval Upshaw had mentioned. They talked about a great many things that had nothing to do with wall insulation. She did not need him. She was clear about that with herself the way you are clear about things that matter. She had not needed anyone to survive this winter, and she would not need anyone to work this claim going forward, and the fact of his company was not a rescue. It was something else, something she had not expected and had not been looking for, and which arrived as most of the important things in her life had arrived by a route she would not have predicted. Solveig Eklund died on the 22nd of March, a week after the equinox, in her own cabin, in the bed she had slept in, alone since 1847. She was not in pain at the end, or if she was, she did not say so. And the people who were with her, which were Hattie and Ada, and in the last hour, Reverend Finley agreed afterward that her face at the end was the face of a person completing something rather than losing it. She had been awake that morning. She had asked Hattie about the church ceiling canvas, whether it had held through the February cold. Hattie told her it had held perfectly. Solveig said that was correct, that canvas was better than wool for horizontal application because it did not sag with moisture. She said this as if she was adding a footnote to a document that was otherwise finished. She told Ada that she had done well this winter. Ada said she'd had good instruction. Solveig said instruction was only a beginning, and that Ada had done the larger part herself, which was the part of taking what you were told and doing something useful with it. Ada held Solveig's hand and did not say anything. Solveig let her. When Reverend Finley came in the last hour, she looked at him with the pale eyes and said clearly, "You are a better man than your church has asked you to be. Be the better one." He sat with her until she was gone. Hattie went outside after. The snow was gone from the south-facing slope behind the cabin, and the first grass was showing through that particular yellow-green of very early prairie growth that is nothing like summer grass and everything like the idea of summer. She stood in it for a long time. The cabin behind her was warm. She could feel it from the doorway, the faint exhale of warm air that met the cool spring air at the threshold. Solveig's system, 40 years refined, holding the heat of a fire that had gone out 2 days ago. Dead air, doing nothing, accomplishing everything. The funeral was small. Hattie Ada Norval, Upshaw, Reverend Finley Kermit, Hallmark. Newton Renfro, and four others who had come to know Solveig Eklund in the last months of her life through the changed weather of the settlement's attention. It was more than had attended any event involving Solveig Eklund in the previous 40 years. Queenie Finley sat in the back row. She had come without being asked and without announcement. She had dressed as she dressed for all funerals in good black wool, and she sat upright in her chair through the Reverend's words and the silences between them. She did not speak during the service. Afterward, standing in the yard in the March cold, she approached Hattie. Hattie waited. Queenie did not attempt an apology. She seemed to know that this was not the moment for one, or perhaps she knew that what she had done over the course of the winter was not a thing that a sentence could cover. She stood in front of Hattie in her good black coat and looked at her directly. She should have been known better, Queenie said, while she was alive. Yes, Hattie said, she should have. I intend to make certain the record reflects what she did, in the settlement's records, by name. Hattie looked at her. The winner was between them all of it, every word that had been said and not said, every way that this woman had tried to manage her into a smaller life. And also the cup of coffee on the table in February. Also the wool for the north wall of the church donated without announcement. Also the standing at the grave of a woman she had never made time to know, saying that the failure of attention was real and that she intended to correct what could be corrected. People surprised you in both directions. That was what Solveig had said. Solveig Eklund's name goes first, Hattie said. On any record, before mine. I understand, Queenie said. She walked back to her buggy. She did not look back, which was not coldness. It was simply the way Queenie Finley moved through things forward with the bearing of a person who has made up her mind and intends to keep it. Ada appeared beside Hattie. They stood together and watched Queenie drive east. She came, Ada said. She came, Hattie agreed. They were quiet for a moment. I put a deposit on the Reinhold parcel, Ada said. The East 40. The family is selling in the spring. She said it without ceremony, the way she had learned to say important things. I will need to build before fall. A small structure, one room to start. Hattie looked at her. Ada looked back with the expression of a woman who has made a decision about the direction of her life and is informing rather than asking. You'll want good steaks, Hattie said. I have extra. Ada almost smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. Norval Upshaw walked past them toward his wagon, pausing long enough to say that he had received an inquiry from a newspaper in Topeka regarding the instruction sheets he had been distributing, and that a man from the state agricultural office had come into the store last week asking questions. He said it in the same flat tone he used for commodity prices, the tone that communicated significance without drama. Then he climbed into his wagon and drove east. Newton Renfro had waited at the edge of the gathering while the others spoke with the patience of a man who understands the correct time to speak and the correct time to stand quietly at a distance and allow things to be what they are. When the yard had cleared, he walked over to where Hattie was standing. I'm going to start on the wall hangings next week, he said. The north wall first. The north wall first, she agreed, always. He nodded. He looked at Solveig's cabin behind them, the small structure with its 40 years of careful work inside it, warm, still warm even now. She built something, he said, that lasts. She did, Hattie said. They stood in the March sun for a moment, the two of them, with the new grass starting under the old. She married Newton Renfro in September of 1889, 3 years after Alvin died and 1 year after the settlement's wood consumption had been reduced by almost a third across 15 households, a fact that Norval Upshaw had documented in a letter to the State Agricultural Office, and that the State Agricultural Office had forwarded to a land management bureau in Washington with a note that the method warranted further study. They had 5 children. All of them grew up in a house with quilted walls and a fire that burned low, and a mother who kept notebooks and a father who built things carefully and measured twice. All of them learned before they learned much else that the way to hold heat was not to make more of it, but to stop it from leaving. The cabin was torn down in 1923 when Hattie and Newton built a proper frame house on the same site with insulated walls and double-pane windows and a furnace in the basement. The technology had caught up to the principle. The principle was the same. The quilts survived. The double wedding ring, the one Hattie's grandmother had made in Pennsylvania, the one that had hung on the north wall through the winter of 1886 and done its invisible work in the dark. It passed to Hattie's oldest daughter and then to her daughter's daughter, and then in 1951 to the County Historical Society, where it was cleaned and mounted and placed in a case in the building on the main street of the town that the settlement had become. The card beside it read, "Double Wedding Ring Quilt, attributed to the Marsh family, Eastern Kansas, circa 1860. Used as wall insulation during the winter of 1886 by Hattie Marsh, following the dead air method taught to her by Solveig Eklund, a Swedish immigrant who had practiced the technique since 1847. The method subsequently spread through the county and contributed to measurable reductions in fuel consumption among pioneer households. Both women are credited with its regional adoption. Two names, in that order. People stopped in front of that case and read the card and looked at the quilt and tried to imagine a woman in a one-room cabin on the Kansas winter flats and alone with half enough wood in a community that had already decided how her story would end, hanging her grandmother's most precious work on a cold wall and waiting to see if the air behind it would do what she had been told it would do. The air had done its job. She had done hers. What she built did not look like much from the outside, a small cabin in the grass, the windows dark before dawn, one woman and one stove and a collection of old quilts hung 5 inches from the wall. Not a monument, not a declaration, just a room that held its warmth through the longest winter anyone in the county could remember, while outside the cold pressed against the logs and found every night that there was something between it and the heat it was looking for. Something that did nothing. Something that by doing nothing did everything. The real lesson was never about the quilts. It was about what happens when a person decides to understand a problem instead of simply enduring it. When a person sits down next to someone the rest of the room has decided to ignore and listens all the way to the end. When a person measures twice and hangs the heavy ones on the north wall first and checks every corner and does the arithmetic and writes it all down and then gets up the next morning and does it again. Solveig Eklund knew this. She had known it for 40 years in a language no one in the settlement had bothered to learn. Hattie Marsh learned it in a November afternoon by a general store stove, and she carried it through a winter that was supposed to finish her, and she came out the other side with enough wood left over to make the point without needing to raise her voice. She had not survived by being stronger than the winter. She had survived by being smarter than the cold.